Welcome to today's event for the people, public service in the 21st century, in 21st century America, with Perry Worldhouse visiting fellow, retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and New Yorker journalist Susan Glasser. We could not be more honored to host Lieutenant Colonel Vindman as a fellow this year and for his first public event at the University of Pennsylvania to discuss his service in the Army and in the White House of President Donald Trump. This is a particularly apt day for this event, the anniversary of his testimony before Congress as part of the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. Thank you both for being with us here today. It's my honor to introduce you. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman most recently served as the Director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Russia on the White House's National Security Council. Prior to retiring from the U.S. Army, he served as a Foreign Area Officer with assignments in Moscow and for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a Political Military Affairs Officer. He's currently a doctoral student at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and as I mentioned, a visiting fellow here at Perry Worldhouse. He's going to be in conversation with Susan Glasser. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a weekly column on life in Donald Trump's Washington. She has served as the top editor of several important Washington publications, most recently Politico magazine and Politico, and previously was the editor-in-chief of foreign policy. She spent a decade at the Washington Post, including as the Post Moscow co-bureau-in-chief, and she's the author with Peter Baker of The Man Who Ran Washington, a critically acclaimed and best-selling biography of former Secretary of State Jim Baker. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Glasser, thanks so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. Thank you to Perry Worldhouse, and of course, thank you to Colonel Vindman, who has agreed to be with us today. As you said, it's really, the timing is quite apt, not only a year to the day from his testimony before the House impeachment inquiry, but in the midst of this most unusual election, a different election than any previous one, including for Colonel Vindman, who has spent a long and distinguished career in the U.S. military, dedicated himself to nonpartisan and apolitical national security positions following Russia and the former Soviet Union, where he was born, and obviously a subject of fascination for me and my professional life as well. There's so very much for us to talk about, Colonel Vindman. It's hard to know where to start. Big news for you personally this week, right? You have announced this week that you're going to be writing a book, at which presumably you will be discussing even more of this. And the title of that book comes from the title of your testimony and on Capitol Hill, right? Right Matters. Is that right?
That is correct. Susan, let me thank you first for moderating this conversation, Michael for hosting it, and Perry Worldhouse for offering me the opportunity to be a visiting fellow. And I hope this does not really follow too close to last year, where I was stuck in testimony for 10.5 hours. I know it doesn't, but I think that's a pretty funny place to start. Yes, that's right. So in my testimony, in my open testimony in front of Congress that the public saw in the middle, about 3 weeks from now, last year, in a question from Representative Maloney, he asked me why I had confidence that things would ultimately work out. And I described my views on service and the fact that my brothers and I have all served, and it kind of is a really an important component of our lives and our identities. And I kind of completed with the thought of "Here Right Matters," and that seemed to be a phrase that resonated, and I've had some time to reflect on what "Here Right Matters" means, and I recognized it was kind of a layered notion of right mattering to me in that moment because my values were being challenged, right mattering in the context of a critical impeachment, and really, frankly, with little precedent. Only a couple of other times have we been faced with these types of situations. And then right matters because this is America, and here right matters.
Well, there's no, we probably won't be getting questions from Devin Nunes and Jim Jordan today, in the top function, although if we did, I would certainly be interested in what questions they have for you. But, I want to unpack this notion of right matters a little bit more. People obviously are familiar with your testimony. As you reflected on it, does the fact that President Trump was acquitted in such a party line way in the Senate, does that alter your view about whether there is, in fact, accountability in our system?
It doesn't. It's interesting that I would say that many people kind of take that statement at its kind of most superficial face value, and that somehow the events dispelled that notion. That's not the way I was looking at it. Frankly, I knew what I was getting myself into, if not on that very first day on July 25th, when I expressed my concerns. Certainly, by the time I was emerging as a called upon to testify, that this was going to have significant repercussions for my career and for my life. Always hopeful that the fact that somehow I would manage to kind of evade the most extreme consequences, but it was never a kind of a superficial notion. And I kind of recognized my role as maybe a figure in a much bigger political process that was going to be determined, and the outcome is going to be determined by political actors. And my role was simply to be a fact witness, appear, and provide testimony on what I had observed and what I had witnessed, providing kind of almost the only kind of unique context that I had as the director for Ukraine. So I think that, yes, it was likely that the Senate was going to acquit. Looking at historical patterns, that's always been the case, and I'm a historian by background, so I didn't miss that. But it's still an accountability in the fact that the House did its job and impeached the president. That's a monumental monumental event, and in less than a week, in what, 4 or 5 days, we will have the American public render its final opinion. And removal didn't occur by the Senate at the beginning of this year, but we'll see how things play out in the next couple of days. We might end up in the same place.
So, I mean, a lot of people, right, when they see the example that you set in these impeachment proceedings, and that other, career professionals in national security or diplomats like George Kent, and wonder what caused you to be willing to speak out when so many others would not, including others who clearly had strong reservations about President Trump and saw him from the inside. People like your former superiors in the military, John Kelly and Jim Mattis, particularly come to mind here. Can you help us to understand that? Why do you think some people chose to take this risk and the majority did not?
So that's something that I've been pondering over, frankly, reflecting on in great detail, and it's probably not a very flattering answer. I think in part there is a absolutely justified notion that the military should be apolitical. This is not some sort of uh, you know Latin American dictatorship from years past or something of that nature, where the military plays an active role. That's not the kind of society we've built over several hundred years. And I take that notion very seriously, and I think military officers take that notion very seriously too. But that's very different than understanding that we have a duty to live up to our oaths. And in my case, I was subpoenaed by a co-equal branch of government. There is actually statute that directs military officers to appear to testify in front of Congress when called upon. That's separate to the oath, and I had an obligation to fulfill that. And frankly, it really probably upset my very basic notion of justice and what's right and what's wrong. And I was not going to sit on the sidelines and let basically the commander in chief, with a direct line for a military officer in terms of reporting chain. He's at the top of it, but I still the president is not above the law, and the president could not get away with basically undermining the very foundation of our democracy. So I had strong views on on the offense that was committed, and I had strong views on my role and my duty, living up to my obligations as a military service member, as a government official that had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution. And I think it was that simple. I guess the answer to the why others did not, this might be unflattering, is I think there's a little bit of self-service in not going down the road of criticizing the commander in chief. When they took off their uniforms and basically were sworn into their positions, that's the case for Mattis. I'm not sure if the chief of staff gets sworn in. He did, obviously, for Homeland Security, but they still have an oath to the Constitution that they swore, but they're also political actors. So they are no longer, they don't really have that coverage of being a general officer anymore. They're now political actors. They have to be partisan in supporting the president. And maybe that could have been an element to why there was an internal conflict as to why they might not step forward. And then less flattering is the notion that they have interests. They've worked really, really hard to get to the point in their career where they could actually make their lives, their families' lives comfortable. And speaking out against the president could upset the apple cart in terms of opportunities, and then subject themselves to criticism, like I have been by the president and his proxies. So there's probably, I mean, I'm the outsider looking in, so I don't know if any of this is definitive, but those are my thoughts on why things may have unfolded the way they have.
Well, I do. I think, right, like a lot of people like you have been trying to reflect on this and understand this. I remember going to an event for Jim Mattis when he released his memoir, which hardly deals at all with his service in the Trump administration. And he was asked this question, as you might imagine, at this book party. And John Allen, the former Marine general who is now the head of Brookings and was a close friend of Jim Mattis's from their time together in the Marines, was there. And Mattis just ripped into John Allen and others who Allen had endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016 and had spoken out very forcefully against Donald Trump after he had retired from the military. But Mattis nonetheless castigated him while he was there in person at this book party, and said essentially that even after he had shed the uniform, that he owed the commander-in-chief some sort of duty of silence, devoir de silence in French. And I think he left the audience mystified by that. Is that something that you ever heard in your time inside the military?
No, I think, frankly, it's a bit of an abrogation of responsibility to not speak out when you know something is wrong. There's little doubt that both Kelly and Mattis, Generals Kelly and Mattis, who had a outstanding and celebrated career, highly honorable individuals, stumbled when they had the opportunity to make a difference. And I don't, again, I don't fully understand this.
Yeah.
To me, there are two different questions here. One, what are the obligations from acting officials in government, which I'll address, and then the kind of the question that you asked: what do you do, when you're a former military officer that's lived a set of values, that's taken a step into the public sphere, political sphere, and is now a political actor, regardless of, frankly, what you say. You're not General Mattis, you're Secretary Mattis. And then trying to use the cover of your former rank. It doesn't make a huge, it doesn't make a lot of logical sense to try to do that. And I would also say that pivoting back to this notion of living a life in a particular way, and then having an opportunity to speak out and support the kind of the value systems that you believe, honor, integrity, personal courage, and abrogating them doesn't make a lot of sense. And then criticizing somebody that does, in this case, in your little vignette, that Allen was being criticized because he supported somebody that he felt was going to be a better leader for our country. That doesn't justify criticism. That probably justifies merit. But there's a whole discourse around civil military relations and what role military have. And you have people on both sides, very capable people on both sides of the aisle, making reasonable cases for both outcomes. But getting back to this issue of leaders and what role leaders have in government, I I take this kind of maybe somewhat nuanced view, very different from my wife, who feels this viscerally and feels that the Department of Defense kind of failed us in terms of supporting, a service member that did all the right things, living up to the values. But I take this view that they have a role to fill, and that role is protecting and protecting the institution. And one individual, does not necessarily uh, uh, protecting one individual at the cost of your role doesn't necessarily make a lot of intuitive sense unless you understand the battlefield more comprehensively and understand that having failed to protect me, they eroded kind of their own value system and made themselves susceptible to things like participating in a political show and marching with the president into Lafayette Park after he had, forcibly cleared peaceful protesters. So there's a lot of nuance here. I understand their role that they're trying to protect. I understand that they, believe that they're probably still guardrails, but it's a slippery slope to not kind of stand with your convictions.
Yeah, well, that's in many ways that's the story of the last 4 years, right? Is that the guardrails appearing to be more and more ephemeral at times when he thought there were these constraints on the president, and that actually he's been quite successful in shedding many of those constraints. And so I want to actually step back and take us inside your experience a little bit. I know that many people will be curious about sort of how this story unfolded from your perspective, right? And how you saw it. So we're talking about, our topic today actually is about public service. So tell us, why, were you comfortable from the beginning working on issues related to Russia and Ukraine for a president who had praised Vladimir Putin? And, when did you have a sense that things were not as they should be? I assume that was actually before the perfect phone call with Ukraine.
Sure. So I am fortunate to consider myself part of a splendid cohort of public servants, kind of you know uh, toiling away um, in quiet, out of the public eye. In my case, I've been brought out of the public eye, but people are doing their jobs. They're doing the very best they can to advance U.S. interests, and somebody has to fill this role. And uh, as long as they kind of make the right calls, hopefully I did, when the time counts, you have to go in there. In my role, I was basically coordinating policy on my portfolio, which included Russia, included Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the Caucasus, and so forth. And I was looking to do the best, capture the best ideas from government and organize those into national policy. So I think there's something to be said about the fact that we have a government with strong institutions, in spite of the president's attacks on these institutions, and he's attacked, all the kind of the preeminent institutions. We still have very capable people trying to fill the same roles that I had been doing before, becoming a public figure and leaving government service. And I think that's important for both esteem and an important takeaway for this whole affair, that the American people had a chance to see this cohort in action. Yes, I did see things going awry earlier on, and yes, I was aware of the fact that the president was not necessarily not like-minded with the rest of the U.S. government on Russia policy. Absolutely, I had come out of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff, understanding kind of the fact that while the government was moving in step to impose costs on Vladimir Putin and the Russian government for Russian aggression and malign influence, that the president was out of line. But I actually had a intellectual view of it. And the way I saw it is, the government is going to continue to impose costs. The president could pursue engagement. So two parallel tracks, both of them very important. The engagement part is extremely important to kind of mitigating the risk of accident miscalculation, adding a huge element of ambiguity to what the U.S. government's actually doing, and that if the president's doing this Probably not to the degree that we had experienced, but if he was doing this in some sort of sophisticated way, that would be a very, very good counterpart to this cost imposing strategy that the rest of the government was moving on. So that's kind of the frame of mind that I moved into, that I had when I moved into my position.
And
I
just
joined,
remind us when that was.
that was July 16th, 2018. So that would have been the day, the first day, my first day was actually the day that the president was meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki.
That's what I was
Uh,
going to say.
yes.
That and did that give you pause? Do you feel that you understand, even to this day, what actually happened in Helsinki?
So it's shocking, and frankly, I had to deal with the fallout domestically. I mean, a lot of the senior leadership was forward, but I was basically fielding, like, all the press inquiries and so forth to try to figure out, what exactly the president, and as with all of his most egregious statements, there's a whole rollback that I had to then take part in. That's not what the president meant, and kind of like, a little bit of spin. Um, you know, that always happens with regards to politics, but in a much, much more kind of unprecedented way with this president. So I knew, I had my work cut out for me, but I also knew that I had the rest of the U.S. government in lockstep on the broader policy, and there's still kind of, you could make hay out of this idea of cost imposition on one side and the president seeking engagement, as long as it's not as egregious as Helsinki. And from that point on, frankly, for the next almost year, we actually had a quasi-normal relationship, because the president, although he had aspirations to continue a relationship with Putin's own miscalculations and missteps prevented it. We had a couple months later, I joined National Security Advisor Bolton for talks with his counterpart Patrushev in Geneva, and then went on to a trip to Ukraine. And that was supposed to be the kind of developing the high level concepts into something concrete, areas of potential cooperation, messaging on what our interests were and what we would defend if the Russians chose to challenge us there. There would be more significant costs. We were working on those lines. And then that kind of was continuing on slowly all the way up to November, I think it was November 25th, 2018, when the Russians attacked Ukrainian naval forces in the Kerch Strait. And, we even there, we kind of said, look, if you guys do the right things, release the sailors, we could continue on this with the track where, we'll have a dialogue pursuing the Helsinki line of, looking for areas of cooperation. They didn't, they miscalculated. And as a result, we basically halted all engagements with them for about 6 months. There were some really tepid talks on counterterrorism, but not much, all the way through kind of the latter portions of 2019. I think the first call that the president had was when there were severe fires in Moscow in the May timeframe.
So basically, it's interesting. You had this searing experience of beginning your assignment in the White House in the midst of this kind of Helsinki meltdown.
Mhm.
Did you perceive that the national security staff saw it as its role to be kind of a bulwark, in Trumpian terms, a deep state? That was a view that he had articulated even before you got there. Was this an embattled group of people that you found there? Do you think that there was any legitimacy to what he said, that you were internally resisting him?
So that's interesting. I would say not. What we really acted on the margins and basically kept the U.S. government moving in lockstep on a couple of really soda straw type activities, like sanctions in response to Russian activities or maintenance sanctions. But we really weren't able to do a lot because the president had proclivities towards Russia, towards Putin. And I found myself actually very quickly shifting off of Russia. And this was, if Yona and I had a conversation about this, that there was little to do. It was kind of a reserve activity of the president and senior leadership to try to act in this general engagement cost imposition line. And I switched over to doing things that I thought were a lot more practical, which is pushing back on Russia externally when it was looking to take an aggressive posture. So in my case, the deep state's interesting. What you have that this label is interesting, because what you have in fact is a series of subject matter experts that have their best ideas on what we should be doing. They make recommendations up, and unless they get direction from the chief executive coming down, they will continue to develop policy. That's the way it works. The president's attentions are actually very, very limited in the foreign policy space. It's kind of like shifting from topic to topic without any kind of broader worldview per se. Regardless of what people say, it's not. It's very transactional. So that leaves a huge amount of space for the subject matter experts to then advance policy, and that's what I was doing for Ukraine. We had come up with a strategy to harden their elections, to basically double down on engagement when Zelensky came into power, and it wasn't a deep state. It was just a lack of direction from senior leadership that provided space. We all kind of marched to the president's direction, as long as it's not illegal. If he had specific guidance, we would be obligated to fulfill it. But most of the time, he didn't. It is literally, by tweet or kind of limited direction. The policy shift, just to put it in context, the policy shift in Syria that ultimately led to Secretary Mattis's departure was as a result of a single phone call that the president went 180 degrees out from what he had been saying to that point and from the recommendation. And it's just it's scattershot. It's what his gut instinct says. And most of the time, it's like I put in my put in that New York Times op-ed, is it's self-serving. What's going to make him feel good, what's going to advance his own personal interests, his own poor gut instincts on what needs to happen, and then everybody else has to pick up the pieces. And I'll just make one other quick note, and I'm sure you'll get into this. But you asked the question about when I knew things were going to went awry with regards to Ukraine policy. It was back in the March timeframe where Masha Yovanovitch, Ambassador Yovanovitch, started to get severe criticism, completely unfounded, about her being a deep stater, anti-Trump, or corrupt and so forth. So I knew things were going awry. I just disconnected that from the fact that the president was somehow involved in it, and I wasn't able to make that. I resisted this notion of believing that the president of the United States, my commander in chief, was complicit in this until it was staring me in the face.
Well, so that's actually a perfect transition, because of course, I wanted to ask you about that perfect phone call, and you were listening to this, and I just wonder, we have a ton of questions. We'll get to those from the audience. Tell us a little bit, like, was that in and of itself the aha moment for you? What was it that triggered it? Was that where you could no longer avoid? You already knew that the ambassador had been forced out. You already knew a certain number of things. You knew that your boss, John Bolton, was very skeptical of this kind of shadow Ukraine policy. So you kind of knew that there was another political effort going on, that you were being excluded from. So what was it about the phone call in particular that just made you react in the way that you did?
So people think that kind of like my life and career miraculously stopped on July 25th. It didn't. I did my duty. I basically reported the call and reported my deep concerns with the call, and articulated those in a way where it was the cohesive narrative of seeing where this began in March. Giuliani's emergence as kind of a key figure, this external influencers, as I referred to in my testimony, playing a prominent role in what should be in policy channels, in part culminating in that July 10th meeting where Sondland proposed the quid pro quo to the Ukrainian National Security Advisor in the meeting with John Bolton. And then ultimately that July 25th call. The first time I made the complaint was actually July 10th for that meeting. And the second time was the July 25th call for the president. What was not yet clear is whether people were acting in kind of on general guidance from the president or explicit direction from the president. And at that point, I kind of was reluctant to believe that the president, I thought people were acting on a general intent. The kind of authoritarian like leader says he would like something to happen a particular way and people just read into it. That's frankly the way things often happen in Russia. But
right. Who will rid me of this damn,
Right, opposition leader. So something like that's sufficient for people to act. But what wasn't clear is that the president was actually, was central and the driving force behind it. And that wasn't clear until July 25th. So I expressed my concerns in the hopes that, like I did on the previous occasion, and every time I raised this issue, which I did, previously in kind of notes to Ambassador Bolton about concerns and so forth, that somehow there would still be an opportunity to kind of right the ship. Somebody pointing out to the president that his actions were criminal potentially would be sufficient to kind of, get him to backtrack and normalize relationships. Get us, I don't know if normalize, but at least lift a hold on security assistance. And none of that was happening. And I really went back to work almost immediately after that call to try to reverse this hold, this policy shift on security assistance to Ukraine. And none of this work from the interagency, from his experts, was sufficient. What ultimately changed the course was the whistleblower's complaint, the House Committee's investigation into the hold on security assistance on September 11th that miraculously lifted this hold. And it was purely political, purely kind of self-serving. The president was caught and he couldn't get away with it, and he had to change course. So maybe I failed in using the existing system process to try to warn off this policy direction. But ultimately, I guess things turned out okay, at least from that policy outcome.
So it's interesting, there are so many good questions, all of which relate to ways we could follow up from this. I'll start getting to those in 1 second. Your boss at the time was John Bolton, who clearly did have strong concerns and reservations throughout his time as national security advisor. How explicit was your, direction from, did you feel like you were operating and doing what he told you to? I know that Fiona Hill, who was your direct supervisor, and I should say my longtime, friend, just from, writing about Russia and relying on her thoughts and expertise, she and you clearly both thought that you were doing what the national security advisor wanted you to do. Were you aware of how broad Bolton's concerns were at that time? His memoir, subsequently released, says that he believed that obstruction of justice had become a way of life for President Trump in the White House, and that in a national security sense, that was not just about Ukraine. How broad were the concerns as you understood them?
So it's interesting that that you asked that. The bottom line answer is no. I don't think any of us were. He's notoriously kind of tight-lipped. My daughter would say his mustache is concealing his, but he's notoriously tight-lipped, and frankly, probably does not take a huge amount of counsel. He's also very experienced in that regard. I would say that we had our own concerns, and the national security apparatus in the White House is really quite flat. You have the president, below him you have the national security advisor, below him you have Fiona Hill, and technically below him you have me. So there's not that many layers to get things done. And most of the time, the directors, the country directors in this kind of apparatus, and the senior directors really kind of execute policy or coordinate, implement policy on the day-to-day basis with kind of limited oversight. For the bulk of my time on the NSC, it seemed like I had that latitude to coordinate with my counterparts and pursue a completely normal, reasonable policy, until things start to go awry in that March 2019 timeframe. It was clear that that Ambassador Bolton was disquieted by what was going on. When we proposed taking a much more firm position in support of Masha Yovanovitch, to kind of this press reporting, and frankly Don Jr.'s own criticism of her, which was unsubstantiated, John Bolton was extremely reluctant to move in that direction. He was seeing behind the scenes the machinations that Giuliani was undertaking. He understood the conversations that Sondland was having with Mulvaney behind his back and so forth. But we didn't necessarily, we saw saw it in fits and starts, but not kind of the unique tapestry. I think there was a one point in Fiona's testimony in which she was talking to Sondland, and she was kind of taken back by when she pushed back on Sondland, like, who does he think he is? Basically taking charge of policy and advocating something completely different than what everybody else was, the direction everybody else was taking. And he said he had direction from the president. So those types of insights that really kind of shift your narrative substantially. So no, we were not seeing it, but most people were still moving in the right direction until the June, July timeframe when this hold came into place. Then it looked like we had two separate policies, and there was all sorts of crisis management to kind of normal, take this really new and unique opportunity with a reform-minded Ukrainian president and really do something with it, help them integrate into the West. And we had these massive countervailing forces on the other side. And it's worth noting that you could see the fallout even of this policy today in Ukraine, with the reporting of the fact that the Constitutional Court has overturned this, basically the fact that you can suffer penalties for falsifying e-declarations on assets. If the U.S. had been involved and was a willing and reliable partner, we could have helped continue to encourage Zelensky and his administration move in the right direction. But what they had was the example of the exact opposite. That frankly, in a lot of ways, we're little different than their worst neighbor, Russia, and are corrupt.
Right.
And,
Well, and that was actually a
yeah.
vivid moment, right? When in actually Kurt Volker's testimony, when he, recounted essentially being told, well, you Americans are going to tell us what to do? Are you
Yeah.
kidding me? Basically. So there's so many good questions, all of which are my questions as well. So I'm just going to jump into those. Max Cohen actually asked us one that I was going to ask, which is, just yesterday we had Miles Taylor coming forward and saying that he had been anonymous writing that New York Times op-ed. My question was a similar question, which is, did you ever consider, rather than going the private whistleblower route, that speaking to the press was something that might be even more effective? And, was there an atmosphere of like leak hunting? And, did you get the sense that there were other anonymous officials who shared a critique of President Trump?
Sure. So it's interesting. I'd say the professionals would disdain this notion of basically leaking information, and it's really almost exclusively the political actors that do this. I think I grew up in a system in which I in a military system, a hierarchical system, and it works. And I expect the system to work, and to do everything I can to make sure the system works, to fix it if need be. We have this tradition in the military of making on-the-spot corrections. If you see something, you have to, you're obligated to correct it. And I was going to work in that system. I was not going to go down the road, of leaking. It's possible something could have driven me over the edge at some point, but I had never considered this idea of kind of leaking. I was going to use the proper channels. If in my case, we don't have an inspector general in the National Security Council, we have the legal shop. It was established after the Iran-Contra affair and the Tower Commission report that said that there needed to be some oversight for the operations of the NSC, and I was leveraging that system to do the right thing. The whistleblower ultimately used the same kind of channel, and it was effective because he used the same channel to report through the IG, and the IG's report, investigation into the whistleblower's report is what ended up precipitating this inquiry. So everybody doing the right thing, kind of, to the best of their ability, does actually work. I don't think leaking is sometimes it's necessary. I mean, it's hard to dispute the fact that you needed a deep throat, John Dean in Watergate in order to kind of uncover what had really been going on. But I think, in my view, I still have, I still trust the system to work. I frankly trust that after this administration changes over, whenever it happens, you'll have kind of a return to normalcy, and you'll have very honorable, skilled, values-based leaders doing the right thing. It's going to take some work. It's going to take us some work to get back to normal. But I think that's what's required. That doesn't undermine this notion of the absolute value of I think the fourth estate, right? Press. So it doesn't undermine their role and their role in kind of exposing misdeeds. But I guess that's just not my background. It's not where I was, and I my complaints to my chain of command were contributed to the way things turned out. The whistleblowers' complaints, same way. So
That's interesting because so you have this theory of a return to normal, which is interesting because there's a good question from another friend of mine and career long Russia watcher, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who was the ambassador to Moscow when I was based there for the Washington Post, and he asked actually whether that is sufficient. That it just to not have Donald Trump as president. Do we need some sort of reforms to guard against any repeat of what you saw in terms of the politicization of the NSC staff and a fear that we've blown up national security policymaking? Do you think that's necessary?
yeah, Ambassador Vershbow, thank you for the question. I think the last time I saw you was actually in our offices at the NSC. So I think there is going to be a need for reform, which is unfortunate. I think there are always adjustments per each administration. Those are important adjustments, but they're actually kind of on the margins. I think there will need to be a reform. I think the NSC is geared to be basically an apolitical organization, although the senior directors are traditionally kind of, while they have subject matter expertise in their areas, they tend to kind of have some sort of party affiliation. We need to get back to something of that nature where it's a mix of a political actor, but with a deep expertise. What I fear is in our efforts to reform, to ensure that the egregious abuses of this administration don't recur, we actually make ourselves less capable of competing with our most potent adversaries in great power competition. I'm thinking about the fact that in the Pentagon, on the Joint Staff, we were looking at kind of an expansion of authorities and capabilities that the executive branches would need to, in an agile way, respond to threats. That could be in the cyber domain. It could be in any number of domains. And what we've had is that the legislative branch is going to have to assert its authority and provide some oversight. So instead of providing these authorities that are required to be more effective in great power competition, we're going to probably ratchet down on authorities and reduce our ability to be effective. And that might be one of the more long-lasting and most troublesome consequences of this administration. We have undermined the confidence in the executive branch, and when we actually needed the executive branch to be a reliable and effective branch of government to respond to new kind of unprecedented threats. And that's really what concerns me. What the next NSC looks like is an interesting question. I think there's a bit of an artificial restraint or constraint put down on the size of the NSC. Challenges have become very difficult and complex, and you need a coordinating body to pull together the rest of the government. State Department, as awesome and capable an organization as that is, Defense, Homeland, IC, they have their own kind of stovepipe view of the world. You need something that looks at whole of government solutions. And I hope that we have a robust, sufficiently capable NSC to help us manage problems into the future. Maybe the last point I'd make is that right now the NSC is basically is not accountable to the legislative branch. It does not, the positions are not confirmed. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more oversight, congressional oversight. I don't know if that means confirmation, but some sort of additional oversight. So like this, we don't have a repeat of the last 4 years.
Well, that's a very interesting, provocative idea. Do you think that a lot of people have mentioned in their questions this new order on civil service, that what executive order that seems to radically reduce the number of positions that would be protected that President Trump has just signed? It actually hasn't gotten that much attention because we're in the final throes of this campaign. How serious do you think that is? And are there additional fail safes? If we're at the point of relying on whistleblowers and people like you participating in the whistleblower process, isn't that like supposed to be like our in case of emergency, smash glass button? I mean, can we do better than that?
It's I think it should not be underestimated the kind of damage that this particular executive order can do. What concerns me is, in spite of all of the damage that the president has done to kind of the political class within the departments and agencies, he has not been kind of particularly successful in politicizing these honorable bureaucrats. That's not it shouldn't be a pejorative term. These are very skilled, lifelong public servants that I would urge, folks at UPenn and Perry Worldhouse to consider, how they're contributing, what their public service is. Just a plug there, but the president has not been particularly effective in eroding this particular class, and this executive order goes a long way to doing that. These are kind of the top tier GS level public servants that if they become politicized, where the rubber meets the road, where policy is kind of in its detail is crafted and implemented, then we face some really unprecedented challenges. I recall, if my memory serves, I think some of these were instituted as a result of a poor political, a poor bureaucratic class emerging from kind of the corruption in President Grant's period. So we've had a long-standing reform in bureaucracy to 150 years almost of this kind of precedent of a professional class that is being undone to serve one man's and his kind of circle's interest. That's very troubling. I hope it does get a lot more coverage, and I wonder if it can be undone because you have lower level people, lower level political actors that are going to look for places where they could park themselves in future administrations. I'm not sure if it can be undone that easily.
Well, that's the interesting question. Of course, it's set for January 19th, 2021, not January 20th, the day of the new inauguration.
Right.
A lot of questions which I want to get to on the upcoming election, your thoughts about that. But first, I do think there's a remaining big question for me and from some of our listeners as well. We're 4 years into this Trump administration. Do you think that we know everything that ultimately we will know about Donald Trump and why he says these things about Vladimir Putin and what relation, if any, there is? You were more informed than any of us could have hoped to be from the inside. Like, what gives with Trump and Putin?
Yeah. So there are two parts to that question. I'll do the easy one first. I think the Russia policy, Ukraine policy is a microcosm of kind of the broader issues with the president's foreign policy. And John Gans of Perry Worldhouse and I kind of wrote an article about this, that we may frankly never know all of the self-serving policy, all the self-serving activities that the president has taken and kind of undone policy, advancing U.S. interests. So I think there's got to be an accounting. There should be an accounting. It seems unprecedented for an investigation to a former president, but this has been such an egregious 4 years that there should be some sort of bipartisan commission to look into what's going on. It's going to be a many year-long process to look into it and discover all the misdeeds. And then you need to let justice play out. There can't be just a notion of letting bygones be bygones and moving on. which is what we would advise to other countries, actually. But now we see the challenges ourselves. How do you? There has to be kind of like almost a truth and reconciliation committee after these last 4 years, and that's a question that should not be kind of just set aside. Although it is a distraction from getting back to normal, it is a distraction from advancing policy. So first step is getting back to normal, then advancing the kind of the policies that President Biden might want. Those are two critical portions. But even preceding that, you need to do you need to figure out what is actually how we got to this point. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is I think there are a lot of questions about what President Trump was doing with President Putin. I think, in my mind, a lot of them have been answered already. I think the president really has a soft spot for authoritarian leaders, and really admires and wishes to emulate, more importantly, authoritarian leaders. And probably at the head of that pack is Vladimir Putin. So I think that explains a lot of the president's actions. It does not, this notion of whether the Russians have compromise on him can be set aside. I think it can be set aside by pure logic. The Russians would not use compromise on somebody like on Trump, even if they had it. They probably have it, but even if they had it, they wouldn't use it because of the potential for blowback is enormous. This president could easily say, "Well, I did this because the Russians had dirt on me." Do the Russians need that kind of headache, and what the fallout that would have for U.S.-Russia relations? I think not, and I think they're more sophisticated actors, and they already have what I refer to as free chicken with the president. He's already kind of complicit in his mindset on authoritarianism and doing all sorts of damage to undermine American democracy. They don't have to do that much more. But maybe that'll be part of the fact finding.
Well, that's very interesting. And, we could go on about this, but I am interested that you think there is a need for this kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Look in Ukraine, where the U.S. was very critical of President Yanukovych when he wanted to look into Yulia Tymoshenko, whom he had defeated in the presidential election.
It's a tough question. I mean, we have this administration set us up for a perpetual well, look at you type of thing. Basically the counter accusation. Who are you to tell us to do this? It's true, but now we're experiencing it firsthand. Maybe it gives us a little bit more insight into why foreign leaders do this. Now, Yanukovych was doing that for corrupt reasons, frankly. Although Yulia Tymoshenko had baggage also with regards to oil and gas deals. There's no question about that. But he was doing it because he wanted to weaken an opponent. I think that it's a very, very delicate issue, and I think the best way to potentially do this is really a bipartisan commission to start looking into these questions. Maybe even give it, start the asking these questions early, but not make any determinations in the first 6 months, a year. Let the committees do their work, and then kind of set a longer timeline to address these issues. But eventually, these matters need to be addressed. The interesting thing about our system is, frankly, even if the federal government doesn't do it, which I think again is a mistake, the president looks like he's going to have a lot of problems at the state level, and that's not going to go away very easily either. So I think there's a good chance for accountability there.
I can't believe that we're running out of time, but I guess it's not surprising because there's so many good questions. So I want to give you a little bit of a lightning round here at the end, if we can try to get
Sure.
A few more. And so a lot of people want to know, it's just a few days before the election. H.R. McMaster, another former military official who served at the NSC, the Trump NSC, famously says, is a skeptic of voting, and for all the reasons we discussed before. Are you planning to vote? And what is your view? Your wife, you mentioned her, she made an ad, a very powerful ad for Republican voters against Trump recently. Why was it her in the ad and not you? And, what do you think?
Sure. First of all, my wife is amazing. That was a terrific ad. We actually did it through Vote Vets, which is more of and Lincoln Project. But frankly, Vote Vets is where my background is. I'm a vet. They actually tend to be on the progressive side or Democratic side of the scale. Lincoln Project is a I have friends on Lincoln Project, and they have money. So it would seem like a good idea to do a partnership between the two of them. So that's just to address the kind of because there's a question about where my head is in terms of political affiliation.
But you are planning to vote.
I voted, and I voted. I voted for Biden. I think I've made it clear why I voted for Biden. I would encourage everybody to vote, regardless of party, to just go vote. I mean, that's our responsibility as American citizens. That's probably one of our only responsibilities, is to go and vote and participate in the process. It makes you feel better. I tweeted an article, I think from Huffington Post. It makes you feel better if you vote. So I think that's important, and let's just leave it there because you have more questions. Hopefully that answers the question.
No, I think it is. I think it is a good answer. We really are out of time, but I got to ask you, President Trump has just been criticized in so many ways. Often he ignores it. This article, though, in The Atlantic, in which he has expressed repeated disdain for the military and the idea that they were suckers and losers, for having gotten themselves killed or fighting in the military, as he himself did not. Famously got himself out of serving in Vietnam. Did you see any firsthand evidence of that? And what do you think your former colleagues in the military, just a quick couple sentences on how do they look at, this dumpster fire?
Sure. So I was probably not close enough I mean, I know I wasn't close enough to see any of the firsthand comments, but it's absolutely not the least bit surprising. The president just simply does not understand the notion of service. Service is service to, it's doing something for somebody else rather than yourself. That whole concept is foreign to him. So I think, it is not the least bit surprising that he would think that. Frankly, I was privy to some of the fact that he didn't go out to some of the sites in Europe when he was visiting battlefields because it was going to be too much of an inconvenience. That kind of shows, that is a glimpse into that kind of disdain. I think the military which tends to run conservative, has already started to has moved away. There's polling to suggest that he's lost the military, which tends to be conservative, which is pretty amazing. They see through him and see through his disdain for public servants and so forth.
Alex, last question. Your father, you said when you testified a year ago, was concerned about you testifying, an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, understandably wary about what would happen to you as a result of it. How does your dad feel about this now?
He's still anxious. He actually, as his community does, the immigrant community, Soviet immigrant community tends to run very conservative. Anything that smacks of liberalism suggests that, there's a slippery slope to communism, which is where everybody left. So he was a supporter, but he's completely away from that. He's it's like the wool has been lifted from his eyes, and he could see clearly what's been going on. I think he's still concerned about the fact that I gave up a very fruitful career on the cusp of promotion and all sorts of possibilities down the road. But he's hopeful that I will follow like he did, kind of reinvent myself and thrive in America and continue to pursue the American dream.
Colonel Vindman, if President Trump wins next week, are you concerned that you would see further retribution?
I am. Absolutely, I'm concerned. I think the fact is that in a second administration, everybody that's crossed the president will be targeted. There's zero doubt in my mind that everybody that's crossed the president will be targeted, and it'll be targeted by minions that want to just do the president's bidding to ingratiate themselves. But it's also because the president is going to want to settle the score. He's going to want to say, if you were disloyal to me, this is what happens. So this is the kind of world we potentially could live in.
I know I speak for absolutely every single person on this call when they say thank you, not only for spending this time with us, but for your service and for your incredibly powerful and forthright answers today. And I'm going to kick it back over to Michael Horowitz, but thank you, Colonel Vindman.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you, Ms. Glasser, for this incredible event. It's been an honor to have you here at Perry World House, And I hope that this has been inspiring for our audience, and that everybody who is able to, who's registered and able to vote, does so. We hope to see you all back tomorrow when we'll host several other public servants from multiple mayoral administrations to discuss Hurricane Sandy and the effects it had on New York's resilience planning. And then we'll be back the week after the election to discuss U.S. foreign policy over the next 4 years with Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who asked a question today, who's our Wolk Distinguished Fellow at Perry Worldhouse, and Trudy Rubin, a columnist with the Philadelphia Inquirer. So hope you all tune in for that. And thank you again to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Glasser for a tremendous, super interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alex.